Today, the first presentation, I will kind of try to share a bit about my work on positive psychology of religion with focus on my work on hope. And to do this, I want to start by acknowledging my team, most of who they are my students, but at the same time, we've worked together that I see them also as colleagues. David Naz, Emily Pisso, Gabby Oldham, and Danny Whiteheim. And essentially, towards the middle of my presentation, I will have Gabby also share some of our work together. What I'll be doing today would be to sort of, I started a conversation with a friend of mine, Kevin Ladd, as we're thinking about the future of our field and how it's important, I think, to take an integrative science approach to engage psychology of religion. And why I think that's important is because the field of psychology of religion, it's kind of an interesting niche area. And part of that is because of the lack of clarity around what the field is. So, for example, you find that most psychology of religion fields are not either placed in a psychology department. And I think part of that is because there's a lack of understanding as to what our field is. I think that regardless of your expertise in psychology, whether you're a cognitive psychologist, whether you are a developmental psychology, there's room for you to engage with religion. And as a positive psychologist myself, with training in developmental psychology, I'm always thinking about how to fuse positive psychology with psychology of religion. And so I'll try to talk about that as a way to, given the focus of the session, to place our work under that umbrella, but with hope to sort of introduce my program of research and how that helps to me explaining this. And then I'll talk about hope as a psychospiritual strength and look at some of the work that we've done from the Global Flourishing Study, and also give you sort of an insight into how hope kind of predicts subsequent flourishing outcomes from wave two of the Global Flourishing Study. So God help me that we cover all this within 30 minutes. Now, like I mentioned earlier, when we think about psychology, there are several fields of psychology, whether it's cognitive psychology that's interested in belief or interested in God concepts, or maybe if you're a social psychologist, you're interested in identity, group dynamics, you're a developmental psychology, you're interested in lifespan development across time, or you're a clinical health psychologist, you're interested in, some practical things in psychology. Positive psychology, on the other hand, psychologists, on the other hand, we're interested in things like virtues, character strengths, and some of the work that Martin Seligman did, and we could tie it back to Aristotle as well. For those that are interested in neuroscience and religion, you find them also think about the physiological aspects of religion as well, and environmental psychology, which is really very new. And for example, I do work on plays and sacred plays and spiritual ties to plays strictly from a psychological lens, engaging environmental psychology and psychology of religion. And there's so many more fields in subfields of psychology. I think regardless of where you find yourself, or even organizational psychology, for example, there's also ways that it intersects with psychology of religion. Regardless of the field that you find yourself, taking an integrative science or approach allows you, right, to kind of build a coherent synthesis across the subfields, right? It's not multidisciplinary where there's sort of no synthesis. Some do that. It's not necessarily cross-disciplinary where you're trying to borrow an idea from the different fields. Interdisciplinary is also good, but it's just about dialogue. But I think the integrative science approach to psychology of religion allows us to kind of think about, as a developmental psychologist, how can I approach or engage religion? As a positive psychologist, how can I approach and engage religion? This gives us freedom and to kind of engage with our peers that may not understand what we're doing, I believe. And so I'm working on a textbook. So I'm also teaching psychology of religion every summer and with Doctor of Clinical Psychology students. And I took it upon myself after discussion with my friend Kevin Ladd to write a textbook taking an integrative science approach to psychology of religion, where we're looking at all the works that have been done in the field of psychology of religion and classify them. This person, this the approach that they're coming with their work, with hope that for those that might teach the field, teach psychology of religion as a course, can find ways to anchor this. But I had to say that because I think it's important that I uh, couch this under some kind of context. And so, a positive psychology of religion, a fusion of positive psychology and psychology of religion, um, it's an interesting field in itself. Now, that's a bit of a historical context because you could tie this, especially if you're looking at it from a Western lens, you could tie this from the work of Aristotle. He talks about flourishing through virtue, eudaimonia. A lot of philosophers, even psychologists, kind of build their framework of well-being from this. You could also tie it back to early Christianity, where, for example, someone like Thomas Aquinas, who argues about hope, the theological virtues, hope, faith, love, and also talks about dualism, right? But they're essentially emphasizing the spirit, although due to secular emphasis, there's been less emphasis on the role of the spirit in his work, especially in the dualistic framework. But we could also go to the Enlightenment period where religion was questioned by science, religion was questioned by reason and science, and of course, Freud, who I feel to some degree saw religion as an illusion or pathology. And I think a lot of psychologists kind of build from that line of work. And so when you think about psychology, I remember when I told an elderly mentor of mine who, that I loved, that I was going to study psychology. He had this idea that I was, going to the way of Freud, right? And, of course, because of a lack of understanding of what maybe psychology is. Not until the mid 20th century, with the influence of the humanistic psychology, where the shift started to take place away from dysfunction or seeing mental health as some kind of pathology, to where we start to ask questions: what does it really mean to be human, right? The focus on growth, meaning, transcendence, which ushered the way to positive psychology. And most psychologists start to focus on things like well-being, virtue, flourishing, and also religion as an idea of transcendence or spirituality as part of the character strengths, within that field. And religion now began to be valued as a source of strength, especially hope. So I want to introduce Seligman's classification. Any positive psychology or anybody psychologist, or anybody working within the field of well-being, is familiar with the virtues of an action classification, which is sort of a framework that identifies the 4 character strengths and group them into 6 virtues. And if you could look in there, you would find that one of the character strengths there is hope, right? Hope, it's kind of tied on the virtue of transcendence. And I want to zoom into hope. You could look at each of this, and there are incredible scholars that are doing incredible work, for example, on this topics, even work on gratitude, humility. You could find different people, forgiveness as well. You could find different people working in these different areas. Now, what this has done is to help us, to give us like a framework to work with. I'm not saying that we have to be limited to that. But before I talk about hope, I think it's important that I track back and kind of, start with a program of research, my program of research, and why I'm interested in hope. So generally for me, my program of research is, I'm interested in the psychological processes that shape human flourishing across cultures. For anyone following my work, that has been the tone of my work. And I might come from different angles or different perspectives, but ultimately, that's really what my work is all about. And I believe that the psychology of human flourishing can follow four different stages or processes. One is to talk about the mechanisms, right, that shape that drive a flourishing life. The second is also the disruptors, because we might experience flourishing through a particular mechanism, but there are disruptors that we are exposed to that kind of hamper or hinder us from experiencing for or flourishing as we should. But in order for us to deal with or recover from those disruptors, we need some adaptive resources that can help us bounce back. And in doing this, we experience flourishing, the outcomes of flourishing. Let me expand a little bit on that. And so, because, and the point of this is that human flourishing is not a linear thing. We can't just say, oh, hope leads to flourishing. That's very simplistic of an assumption, right? There are disruptors of hope, things that might cause us to lose hope. But then when we lose hope, ultimately, it's important that we think of adaptive responses that can build our hope, that can help us. Like in one of the studies that we did, we looked at religious coping as one of those adaptive responses. I think this was during the pandemic. We looked at how hope was related to well-being and how religious coping moderated our relationship. And we collected data in Colombia and South Africa and found that religious coping, for example, can be an adaptive resource, a protective resource that people can turn to boost their hope when it's lost, right? And in order to experience well-being, sustain our well-being. So the relationship between hope and human flourishing is not necessarily a linear thing. And so it's important that I set this down. And so hope, for example, is a psycho-spiritual resource or strength that can help us ultimately live a flourishing life. Now, let me talk about hope as a psycho-spiritual strength in religious life. At least a definition that I've been toiling with some friends of mine or some colleague is the idea of hope as a psycho-spiritual strength and future-oriented agency and pathway. Now, if you remember the work of Snyder, he talks about agency and pathways. And these unfold within the changing milieu of place. And it's important I've emphasized place because our hopeful aspiration is contingent on the place that we find ourselves. I've tried to kind of engage this particular conversation with a friend of mine who is a philosopher to talk about how the places that we find ourselves kind of shapes the aspiration of hope. But why is hope a psycho-spiritual strength? One, I think, well, it sustains resilience, and most of the studies in this space, is pointing to at least there's four things. It protects people from despair and gives strength to endure hardship. Hope also fuels action, ultimately. It kind of motivates us to kind of set goals and find pathways to make meaning out of life and keep moving forward. It shapes our future, right? It kind of inspires communities and individuals to envision and also build a better future. Now, the way we experience this can be contingent on what Snyder says, if you have agentic hope, but there are some people that are incapacitated that they can't have agentic hope, then they need pathways of hope, resources that can help boost their hope. However, regardless of how hopeful we are, it all happens due to what's happening in place. But also hope kind of anchors our ultimate meaning. Now, you could also think about hope in religious or spiritual life. It's more than just optimism. There's a comparison between hope and optimism. I think optimism is great. It's sort of, that things would improve, right? But I think hope encompasses this. Hope is about having a sense of agency that you can act, right? Hope is about just having the belief that you can act on something and see result. It's also about optimism as well, right? It includes optimism, having that belief that things would improve. But also, especially in a religious life, hope also includes some kind of faith, right? Believing that God is faithful in spite of whatever, it's happening in your life. And so it is both an emotion and a spiritual strength in that sense. Emotion because it gives us confidence that life can improve. You know, and in some, especially in religious contexts, hope is usually nurtured by things like whether religious texts or exaltations. You read something in, let's say, your sacred text, whether it's in the Bible or in the Quran, that kind of motivates you to keep going. Or you hear someone say something that kind of, or also through prayer, contemplation as well, but also in the life of community. Just by being around people. Most people, for example, attend religious services not because of what the preacher is saying, but sometimes just seeing their friends and just that being in a community, especially in a religious community. Now, let me get to some of the work that we've done on the early predictors and disruptors of hope. Remember that I mentioned that for me, I'm interested in the mechanisms of flourishing, and one of those mechanisms is psychospiritual mechanisms, and hope is an example of that. Now, in my other work, I might be interested in psychosocial mechanisms, and I do work on belonging. I'm interested in attachment. I'm interested in place attachment as well. So I might engage that from there. I'm also interested in psychospatial, right, environmental mechanisms as well. So, but for this presentation, I'm focusing on hope as a psychospiritual mechanism and talk about the disruptors of hope across cultures. Now, a bit of a context on our study, the Global Flourishing Study. I'm sure that most of us might be familiar with it. It's a study across 22 countries around the world. We argue that it's kind of at least a representative of the world population because of how the data was collected. I'm happy to go in depth on that on one-on-one questions. But each of the countries where data was collected, we collected nationally representative data, and thanks to Gallup who helped us with this. And I would argue this is the biggest social science research in modern history. It's attracted almost about $60 million so far, and we're yet just in wave 2 of that study. And so the work itself has been very impressive and really received a lot of media attention, which we're grateful for. And so this is the context of the data that we're working with. Now, something I want to mention for anyone that is interested in the Global Flourishing Study, you can always use the data. You could pre-register and request for it. And so this is the participants. I might not be able to go in depth, but just expand on it a little bit. But essentially, the first thing that we noticed in our work is that hope is a lifespan psychospiritual strength. In other words, hope kind of sustains growth and resilience across every stage of life, right? And that we have this paper published in Applied Quality of Life Research, and I would encourage you to check it out if you're interested in the work. And what this means, I'll share some of the things that we found, some of the interesting stuff that we found in the study. For example, in the relationship between early relationships that kids have with their parents and hope. We found some kind of interesting, there was an association between these two. And across the 22 countries, you could see countries that scored higher on this. For example, for relationship with a father, which kind of associated with higher levels of hope, mostly for those in Australia, in Japan, in the United States, and Brazil. For relationship with the mother, you saw that with Spain, Hong Kong, and you could see how these childhood predictors were shaping outcomes of hope. And also, you could also look at some of the countries where these experiences were more of a disruption of hope. Like, for example, with Egypt, right, the relationship with the father, which was a negative relationship, which clearly had a negative association with hope, which implies that for that country, not having a relationship with one's father is a disruptor of hope. And we could also go and talk about parental divorce as well, whether we are looking at the divorced effect, the divorce for those that are divorced or those that are single, and those that their parents have died. You could see how those same effects, and the story is consistent, and how that ultimately shapes hope. And also something that you find as you start to look at this results, you could also say the same thing with financial status. You could say the same thing with childhood abuse and hope. In some countries there were disruptors, in some countries there were not. Even growing up as an outsider and its relationship with hope. You see how that also shapes, for example, in Egypt, if you grew up as an outsider, it actually did not necessarily, it kind of increased your level of hope, which is kind of interesting. Compared to in Australia, if you grew up there as an outsider, it kind of smashes your level of hope. So this all have implications as we talk about disruptors of hope, as things that causes us to lose hope, but also those things are contingent on the places we find ourselves. And so in my case, I try to make a case. We could see that with health as well, with immigration status at the age of 12. And these are childhood predictors when people were retrospectively recall when they were at the age of 12. And you could also see that lifespan across the different age groups as well, and how that varies. The point of this that I'm trying to make is that hope is therefore a cycle. It's also a spatial, place-based spiritual strength. And what I mean by that ultimately is that the hopeful are shaped by their context. Whether your hope and that context is what really predisposes us to the disruptors of hope, to the things that cause us to lose hope. So place becomes very important. And so I've tried to make this argument in what I call spatial hope. And ultimately what I'm trying to say is that where we find ourselves in the world shapes how hopeful we are about the future. In fact, for example, we had some people that were looking forward to coming, attending this conference and being in this conference that were not able to come because, unfortunately, either they didn't get the visa to be here, they were hopeful about coming, but for some reason, because of the context that they were born, they were not able to make it. What do you tell those people to have a genetic hope to be hopeful? Well, they can't beat against the system, but there could be pathways of support that can, in spite of the fact that they're not here, can still bolster their hope. Now, and you could also see this spatial dynamics of hope as a psycho-spiritual strength, and how this plays out in all the 22 countries that we looked at. Of course, Indonesia was the highest, and there are a number of reasons for that, followed by Mexico. Because I don't have time to kind of unpack on all this, and I'm happy to ask questions, and even as you start to look at that as well, one of the interesting things that we found in our work was that whether it's a marital status, employment, which had to do with workplace, education, which had to do with a school, religious attendance, which had to do with a place of worship, or even immigration has to do with country. It's all about place, that it had something to do with hope. Now, I want to talk about the adaptive response and also hope as a psycho-spiritual buffer. I want to introduce my student, Gabby Oldham, to kind of talk about that briefly. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Today I have the privilege of unpacking a little bit of what Dr. Count had started a great conversation on about hope in different cross-cultural contexts. So, as Dr. Counted spoke about, hope can be both a buffer and a bridge. And as we unpack the GFS study, we have gotten to look at a number of different factors, some of which include traumatic stress, mental health outcomes, and hope. My colleagues and I have had the privilege of kind of diving deep into this a little bit. I won't reiterate the variables that Dr. Counted spoke about in regards to the GFS study. You saw the sample size, very large, 22 countries across the world. And what we wanted to look at in our study with this is looking at traumatic stress and mental health outcomes, anxiety and depression, with hope as a buffer. framing this through Lazarus and Folkman's transactional stress model, we conceptualize hope as an internal or external coping resource that helps individuals endure adversity. Additionally, we hypothesize that hope would promote emotions-focused and problem-focused coping responses. So, in other words, hope is both a coping resource and a response. A moment as well to talk about how these concepts were operationalized. First, with traumatic stress in the GSF study, it is very much framed within the question as perceived threat to life and how much one is bothered by that within the last month, I believe it is. And then with hope, it's very much a dispositional framing of hope. So how hopeful are you about the future? And then with anxiety and depression, looking at symptoms of worry, feeling restless on edge, and then feeling low mood, things of that nature. So 2 items each for anxiety and depression. Taking a look at our results here, you will see that we found something a little bit like what might be expected with what Dr. Counted was sharing about the spatial context of hope. So you'll see here, there were countries where hope was a significant buffer and countries where hope was not a significant buffer, and additionally, countries where hope was only significant buffer for either anxiety or depression. So you can see on this next slide a little bit of some country level moderation results with this, looking again at how hope was a buffer or was not a buffer. For these, you can see there was a significant buffer. Again, we're looking at this at high levels of hope, low levels of perceived threat to life, and as to be expected, reduced mental health outcomes. For some of these others, again, as I noted, there were some that we only found results for anxiety or for depression. There were some for which it was not significant in either context. So that raises the question for us as we're interpreting this data, what does this mean? Is hope this kind of universally available buffer for everyone, or is it contextually dependent? And so the way that we are interpreting this is that generally, one thing that should be noted as well, across the board with the global results, there was that significant result as we expected, just on a low level, where lower levels of perceived threat to life and higher levels of hope were associated with lower levels of anxiety and depression. So again, globally, yes, on a low level, they were significant, not for each country. So what that suggests is that generally, hope can be a coping resource and a buffer, and it can promote helpful coping responses. However, an individualistic approach to hope may not tell the full story. Again, if you remember, with that item with which hope was assessed, it was very much looking at a dispositional approach. So am I always hopeful about the future, which may not tell the full story for every culture. Again, as Dr. Counted was noting, depending on the context and the resources that are available. Thus, we concluded that an emic approach to hope may reveal more cultural components of hope that would maybe reflect it as a buffering virtue. And again, that could be explained by the internal versus external loci of hope, or emotional and spiritual hope. Again, we need to do more research to kind of unpack the context. If you have further questions, we'll have the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you. And that's the idea of hope as a buffer, but also it is a bridge. It is a bridge. It bridges what is with hope, bridges what is with what can be. Whether it's the present struggle or the future possibility or an individual effort or transcendent meaning, it is both a buffer and a bridge. And as we wrap up, we could also think about the outcomes of hope as a driver of a flourishing life. And we did this by looking at how hope at Wave 1, a year after we collected the data, predicted some mental well-being outcomes. And this, the summary of that, those that were green were those that had the most strongest effects. But it's been wonderful working on this. I know that our time is fast spent, and across countries, this is what we also have. And I will stop here because sadly I maximized my 30 minutes. But at the end of the session, if you have any question, you can come to me. It's my honor to welcome the next colleague. Thank you.